Welcome to In Session. I'm Danny Savalas. You were just listening to George Zimmerman's phone call to police, all recorded so we can hear. But this morning, we saw Zimmerman in court as his attorneys argued several motions in criminal court. But on the civil side, there's also some legal action happening. George Zimmerman's defense attorneys have filed a lawsuit accusing NBC of doctoring the defendant's 911 call. The defense alleges NBC put the most important sound bites. Essentially, they monkeyed around with them, cut and pasted, and then put them together, and that made George Zimmerman look like a racist. We want you to decide. Take a listen now to NBC's version of the call.
This guy looks like he's up to no good. He looks black.
Did you see what he was wearing?
Yeah, a dark hoodie.
Okay, now let's listen to the unedited version of the call provided by Sanford Police.
This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something. It's raining and he's just walking around looking about.
Okay, and this guy, is he white, black, or Hispanic?
He looks black.
Did you see what he was wearing?
Yeah, a dark hoodie, like a gray hoodie, and either jeans or sweatpants and white tennis shoes. He's here now. He was just staring.
Little different? I think so. I want to bring in session correspondent Beth Karras, in-session correspondent Gene Casares, and defamation attorney Mitchell Langberg. Mitchell, I want to get right to it with you. Bottom line, this lawsuit as filed, defamation, you have to show two things, essentially. It's someone made an untrue statement, but secondly, that there is damages. Let's talk first about that first prong. Are there allegations sufficient here that there was an untrue statement?
Hi, yes, thank you for having me. There are three statements that they allege to be untrue, and at least one of them is potentially defamatory. The three things are, they say that the way that this thing was put together creates an implied defamatory statement that Mr. Zimmerman was a racist. They say that he also was falsely accused of using a racial epithet. And those two things, the first one, if it's false that he used a racial epithet, that would support a defamation claim. The accusation implicitly that he's a racist, that's a closer call. There's courts throughout the country that don't agree on this. Some say that it's a non-actionable opinion. Others say that it could potentially be an actionable statement of fact. So it's a close call on that.
You know, Mitch, I want to actually have our viewers see, because if you go online, you can find the complaint pretty easily. Read it. It is they put the statements side by side, and if they are true, this is a pretty clear case of cutting and pasting. Let's start with the statements. Let's start with March 19. March 19, they make the following statement. Quote, Zimmerman, there's this real suspicious guy. This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he is on drugs or something. He looks black. Look at those two right together. Dispatcher question, are you following him? Zimmerman, yeah. Dispatcher, okay, we don't need you to do that. Zimmerman, okay. That's March 19. This is important. The next day, March 20, 2012, Zimmerman, this guy looks like he's up to no good or on drugs or something. He's got his hand in his waistband. Now, that came from a whole other area. That's new. And he's a black male. Dispatcher, are you following him? Zimmerman, yeah. Dispatcher, okay, we don't need you to do that. Moving on. March 22, 2012. Remember, this is the same company, NBC, within days of each other. Zimmerman, this is the third audio. He looks like he's up to no good. He looks black. Dispatcher, did you see what he was wearing? Zimmerman, yeah, a dark hoodie. Okay, now, those are the three so far that we know of. I'm going to read you now the actual transcript as alleged in the complaint. Zimmerman, folks, after I read this, I ask you, I'm going to ask, you have to make the decision. I'm going to ask my panel, if true, what this bodes for the case. This is the actual transcript. Zimmerman, this guy looks like he's up to no good or he's on drugs or something. It's raining and he's just walking around looking about. Dispatcher, okay, and this guy, is he white, black, or Hispanic? Zimmerman, in answer to that question, says he looks black. Mitch, I want to go back to you briefly. When it comes to making a false statement, cutting and pasting these lines together, does that constitute a false statement?
It does. The courts have been clear that misquoting somebody can be a false statement itself. There's a lot easier of a thing to prove for Zimmerman than the implication of racism. Suggesting that he, without any request from the 911 officer, identified Trayvon Martin as an African American, as black, as part of his description of why he is suspicious. That in and of itself could be defamatory since it's false. We know it's false because it was cut and pasted.
Gene Casares, if NBC responds and alleges some either harmless error or mistake, how difficult will it be to prove this when day after day, one day after the other, and then on a third day, there are three different splicings, three different misrepresentations of the same recording? How difficult will that be for NBC to wiggle out of?
Well, I think that's going to be the defense. And, you know, an editor is the one that does the splicing and does the editing. And you've got about a minute and a half. The editor is not an attorney. The editor is just trying to condense something to make air. I think the challenge will be for NBC is what was wrapped around that 911 call, the commentary, the conclusionary statements of the racial epithet that was made by George Zimmerman. That's going to be, I think, the big challenge. But remember, they are asserting here that George Zimmerman is a public figure. So not only that the defendants had knowledge of, but acted in reckless disregard. That's a higher standard right there.
Beth Karas, even if someone is the staunchest George Zimmerman opponent, even if they dislike George Zimmerman and think he is guilty, I can't imagine anyone who would argue that taking these words and portraying George Zimmerman the way that NBC allegedly did is unfair. How significant was this misrepresentation, this audio that was broadcast to the world? How significant was that in the public's perception of George Zimmerman in this case?
Well, you know, NBC wasn't the only news outlet reporting on this. They happen to be the one being sued, perhaps in Mark O'Mara and the civil firm from Philadelphia who has filed this with O'Mara. In their opinion, it was the most egregious misrepresentation, but this whole story was going viral, and everyone was kind of making this early conclusion about George Zimmerman. But Danny, I have a question for Mitch also, and you know, there's that added element of malice if a person's a public figure. But George Zimmerman was a nobody then. You could argue he's a public figure now. When did the courts determine, you know, whether malice is required? I mean, I guess he wouldn't be a public figure at the time the statements were made. Is that correct?
That's right. There's two ways to become a public figure. One is that you're a public figure, such as an athlete or an actor. The other is if you voluntarily thrust yourself into the heart of a public controversy. He's not going to fit into either of those, I believe. He may be a public figure now. He certainly has appeared and made statements and had his Facebook website and things of that nature that indicate subsequently he thrust himself into the heart of this public controversy. But the media cannot involuntarily, by creating a story, put you into a public controversy. So though there'll be a battle and there's arguments to be made on both sides, I think the law is going to support Zimmerman on this, that he's not a public figure, which will mean that he won't have to prove that NBC knew it was false or acted with reckless disregard for truth. He'll just have to prove that they were negligent in publishing a false statement.
Now, Mark O'Mara said, we have sound of Mark O'Mara saying that this happened not once, not twice, but thrice. And it is a hard thing to dispute that there are these three different splicing together of sound that could have been accidental. Take a listen to this sound of Mark O'Mara talking about the three times that this happened.
The reality is that the way this case was handled in the beginning turned it into a fireball of frustration for the entire nation. And we'll deal with it. I'd love to deal with it in a better way than we're dealing with it already, but we'll deal with it. My concern is that my client has to deal with it in a way that he shouldn't have to.
Mitch Langberg, I can't tell you how often someone comes to me and says, you know, my Aunt Edna said something nasty about me on Facebook. Can I sue her? And then I have to explain to them that, well, I mean, if you want to throw good money after bad, you're going to have to show that those damages caused you some monetary loss. Tell us a little about damages, because critics of this lawsuit have said that Zimmerman may not have damages because other outlets, there was other information out there about him in the public that already painted him in not so nice a light. What about those charges of damages? Can Zimmerman meet his burden and prove damages in this case? And what does he have to show?
Well, actually, the answer is absolutely, and significant damages, because assuming that he can prove that these statements are false, which is his burden, the nature of these statements are such that he can get presumed damages and punitive damages. Presumed damages are actual damages without any proof of any harm or loss whatsoever. On certain kinds of defamation, if you prove the defamation, the jury is allowed to presume that you were injured, and those damages can be significant. For example, we received an award in California just 3 months ago, $17 million of presumed damages alone.
Oh, Mitch, now you're just showing off. Go ahead. No, go ahead. I want us to understand damages.
And that's the reason, by the way, that they've proven, that they've alleged of knowledge of falsity and reckless disregard for truth, not because they'll need it to win the lawsuit, but the Supreme Court of the United States will not allow presumed damages or punitive damages, even for a private figure, unless they've shown knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard for truth. And let me tell you, in Florida, there's a case from just about a year ago where damages were proven to be only $20,000, presumed damages, but the court affirmed a punitive damages award on top of that of $5 million, even though it's a large multiple. So if he can meet his burdens on this case, the damages could be huge.
Yeah, that's compelling. What you're saying is essentially his actual damage out of pocket, the things that he was tangibly damaged in may have only been $20,000. But if it's egregious, punitive is a word for punishing. If we find that somebody acted with some particular malice or well, not legal malice, but particularly badly, then the court can literally punish the person who defamed the plaintiff. And those are limitless, aren't they, Mitch?
Well, let me add that again, the Supreme Court of the United States has put some limit on punitive damages. However, in cases where the conduct is intentional and extremely malicious, courts across the country, including in Florida, have allowed there to be great multiples. So in this case, it could be near limitless. As I said, $5 million in a case just 2 years ago.
All right, panel. Thank you for joining me on that topic.